Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. When we think of the Mughal Empire, what usually comes to mind? It's the emperors, the battles, those incredible monuments, right?
Absolutely. It's those visual spectacles that tend to capture our imaginations.
Right. But today, we're taking a different approach. We're going deeper, beyond those dazzling surfaces, to explore something much less flashy, but I think even more fascinating. The systems that kept this vast empire running.
The nuts and bolts.
Exactly. We're talking about the Mughal legal and administrative systems, the rules and structures that held everything together from, let's say, around 1526 to 1857.
A period of immense change and upheaval, yet the Mughal Empire managed to not only survive, but thrive for centuries.
And it's these systems, often overlooked, that played a huge role in that success. So we're going to unpack how these systems worked, how they evolved over time, and most importantly, how they influenced later Indian states.
It's amazing how these legacies live on.
It really is. We've got some great sources to guide us on this journey: scholarly histories, architectural analyses, even personal accounts from the Mughal period.
Real voices from the past, helping us connect those dots.
So, ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Okay, now, when I picture the Mughals, my mind immediately goes to those stunning buildings. Is there a connection between their architecture and their administrative systems?
That's a great place to start. But before we get to the grandeur of Mughal architecture, I think it's worth taking a detour, a seemingly unrelated one. Let's look at the British East India Company's efforts to, well, bring order to Bengal in 1772. Now, here's the irony. The very chaos the British were trying to quell was a direct result of their own earlier interventions.
Well, that's a bit of a twist, isn't it? Trying to fix a problem they created?
Precisely. And that's why understanding the pre-existing Mughal systems becomes crucial. The British, led by Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal, didn't just invent a whole new system out of thin air. They actually built upon the foundations laid by the Mughals.
So even the British, known for their administrative prowess, were taking cues from the Mughals.
They were. In fact, the British revenue system, which they considered a cornerstone of their rule in India, was heavily based on the Mughal ZAP system.
Wait, the ZAP system?
Yes. It involved meticulously documenting land holdings, tax assessments, a practice the Mughals had honed for centuries.
Wow, I never realized how deeply entwined Mughal systems were with later British rule.
It's like peeling back layers of history, uncovering these unexpected connections, right?
Absolutely. So to really understand this, we need to unpack those Mughal systems. What were the key features that made them so influential?
Well, let's start with land grants. They were absolutely central to Mughal governance. And it wasn't just about rewarding loyal followers, it was much more strategic. Land grants played a pivotal role in shaping social hierarchies and political alliances, not just during the Mughal era, but even before that.
So it wasn't simply who owned the land, but the status and power that came with it.
Exactly. Land ownership was the key to social standing and political influence. Ambitious families, individuals, they all strategically used land grants to climb the social ladder, gain a foothold in the existing power structures.
And the Mughals understood and leveraged this dynamic.
Precisely. They used it to maintain stability and control. Now, did they just follow existing practices, or did they introduce any innovations?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too.
Well, they did both. The Mughals were masters of adaptation. They integrated elements from Persian, Timurid, and Indian traditions, creating this unique administrative apparatus. For example, they adopted the Mansabdari system from Persia.
The Mansabdari system.
It was a hierarchical system. Think of it as ranking officials based on their military obligations, the number of troops they commanded.
So a way to centralize military power, ensure loyalty within the ranks.
Exactly. It helped streamline their bureaucracy and maintain a strong, centralized authority. So it was this clever blend of borrowing and inventing, adapting existing systems to their own needs and context.
It really highlights that dance of continuity and transformation you mentioned earlier. But, when we talk about the Mughals, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. We're talking about Muslim rulers governing a predominantly Hindu population. How did that dynamic play out in their administrative systems?
That's a crucial question. And to answer it, let's look at the role of Brahmins. They're the priestly class in Hinduism. Often we think of them purely in religious terms. But there were also key players in maintaining social order in Mughal India.
Wait, Brahmins were more than just priests. They were involved in the nitty-gritty of Mughal administration.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. Mughal rulers strategically granted land to Brahmins. And this wasn't just about religious piety or patronage, it was a calculated political move.
Ah, so land grants as a way to solidify control, extend their influence into different regions. Clever.
Right. It was a brilliant way to integrate Hindu elites into their administrative structure. Think of it as building bridges, ensuring stability across this incredibly diverse and vast empire.
So not just about religious tolerance, but about pragmatism, about using existing power structures, even those rooted in a different faith, to strengthen their rule.
Exactly. A testament to the Mughals' political acumen. They understood that to truly rule, they needed to incorporate, not just impose.
Wow, that completely changes my perception of how the Mughals governed their empire. It wasn't just top-down, but this complex tapestry, weaving together different social and religious groups.
And that tapestry, that interconnectedness, it extended beyond the administrative realm. It's reflected in their architecture as well. In fact, Mughal architecture becomes a tangible expression of their power, their influence, and this blending of cultural influences.
So we've come full circle back to those iconic buildings.
We have, and we'll delve into those in detail in our next segment. But for now, it's important to remember that these seemingly separate aspects, their administrative systems, religious policies, and even their architecture, were all intricately linked. Each played a part in the Mughal Empire's stability and ultimately its success.
That's a fantastic point. I'm starting to see how this deep dive is going to be about more than just the what of Mughal rule, but also the why, their choices and the long-lasting impact of those choices.
Exactly. We'll be right back after a short break to continue our exploration.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about Mughal architecture and how it was, well, more than just pretty buildings.
Right. It's about projecting power, influence, and it wasn't just limited to those big cities, it spread. Think about those incredible sarais, the roadside inns all across the empire.
Oh, yeah. I've seen pictures. Stunning. But how does a roadside inn connect back to administration?
Think about it. They're strategically placed along major trade routes, right? Providing safety, comfort for travelers, protecting those goods.
Okay, yeah.
But also showcasing that Mughal architectural grandeur. Anyone passing through, bam, hit with that image of power, reach.
So practical, but also a statement, like a billboard for the empire.
Exactly. It highlights just how vital trade was to their economy. These sarais weren't just random acts of generosity, they were a calculated part of that administrative strategy. Keep trade flowing, project that image of a well-run, prosperous empire.
I bet those sarais also tell us something about how the Mughals delegated authority, right? I mean, the emperors couldn't have been overseeing every little construction project personally, could they?
That would have been a lot. Even for a Mughal emperor, they certainly encouraged it. Sign of good governance, right? But nobles, they were eager to jump in too. Building a grand sarai, not just charity. It's a way to show loyalty to the emperor and to flaunt their own wealth a little bit.
So a bit of political maneuvering going on there, like a competition. Who can build the most impressive sarai, getting the emperor's good graces?
Definitely a way to gain some points with the emperor, prestige within the court. And don't forget the economic incentives. A lot of these nobles, they were involved in trade themselves. So investing in a sarai along a major trade route, smart move. Protect your goods, keep things moving smoothly.
Win-win all around. Emperor gets a flourishing trade network. Nobles get to, well, boost their status, protect their economic interests.
Yeah.
And travelers, they get a nice place to rest. Everyone's happy.
Exactly. You're starting to see that interconnectedness. Political, economic, social life, all woven together. And, it wasn't just the sarais, those gardens, those lavish Mughal gardens.
Oh, yeah, with the fountains and the flowers.
Right. They weren't just about aesthetics either.
Let me guess. Deeper purpose.
Always. Mughal gardens, carefully designed, intricate water features, fragrant plants, pavilions, evoking paradise. Those Persian and Islamic influences shining through.
So a place for, like, contemplation, recreation, but also
Also political gatherings, carefully orchestrated events, projecting that image of imperial power, sophistication.
not just smelling the roses, but wielding power.
Exactly. And of course, the nobles followed suit, creating their own versions of these paradise gardens.
Emulating the emperor, enhancing their status.
Right. So we've got land grants, strategic sarais, magnificent gardens. It seems like everything in the Mughal Empire is tied back to this system of governance and administration. But what about the actual laws? Like, how did they create a unified legal system across such a vast and diverse empire?
Yeah, good question. Were they just imposing one set of laws on everybody?
No, no, it wasn't that simple. The Mughals, they inherited a complex legal landscape. You have Islamic law, customary practices, pre-existing Indian legal traditions. They had to create a framework that could handle all of that diversity.
So they were more interested in what worked than in some rigid ideology.
Very pragmatic rulers, focused on order, stability. They understood that a one-size-fits-all approach wasn't going to work in a territory as vast and diverse as theirs.
Makes sense. So it was more like weaving together different legal strands, creating this tapestry that held the empire together.
A tapestry that, wasn't without its flaws, but it worked for centuries. Think about it. Empires are often portrayed as imposing this harsh, uniform law on their subjects, but the Mughals, they were more nuanced than that.
More adaptable. So it sounds like they understood that effective governing meant balancing that central authority with some regional autonomy, recognizing those unique
Yeah.
needs, customs.
Exactly. But that balancing act, it wasn't without its challenges.
Yeah, I imagine trying to keep track of all those different legal systems, customs must have been a logistical headache.
Yeah.
Not to mention the potential for, well, abuse, inconsistency.
Absolutely. Maintaining consistency, ensuring fairness across such a vast empire, ongoing challenge. There were definitely instances of corruption, abuse of power, unequal application of the law. It wasn't a perfect system.
So how much did the average person living in the Mughal Empire actually feel the impact of all these laws and administrative systems?
That's the question, isn't it? For most people, I think life was probably shaped more by those local customs traditions.
Yeah. The everyday stuff.
Right. The Mughals, they were primarily concerned with order, collecting revenue, not necessarily micromanaging people's daily lives.
Makes sense. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the everyday experiences.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look beyond those official documents, explore local histories, court records, even literary works, to get a glimpse into how these Mughal systems actually played out.
So we're not just talking about laws on paper, but how they were lived, experienced by real people.
Exactly. And that's where things get really fascinating.
It's a lot to take in. Even focusing on this big picture view of Mughal administration, it's impressive. Land grants, sarais, gardens, legal systems, all these seemingly separate aspects, but they were all connected.
Interconnected, each piece contributing to how that empire functioned. And it's this interconnectedness that's key to understanding their lasting impact on India.
Which brings me to my next question. What are some of those most significant ways that the Mughals influenced later Indian states? We talked about that revenue system earlier, the Zabit system.
The revenue system, definitely a key legacy. They developed this incredibly sophisticated system for assessing, collecting land revenue, formed the backbone of their economy.
And the British adopted it.
Adapted and continued it, yeah. And later Indian states as well. That
Yeah.
emphasis on meticulous record keeping, that hierarchical structure of officials, the Mughals laid the groundwork.
It's amazing how a system developed centuries ago could have such a long-lasting impact.
It's the power of institutions, how they shape societies long after their creators are gone. And it wasn't just about the mechanics of collecting revenue either. The Mughal system had these profound social and political implications. It reinforced those existing hierarchies, based on land ownership, control over resources, and those patterns. They continued in later Indian states. Control the land, you wield the power.
So that theme of interconnectedness again. Economics, politics, social structures, all tied together.
Right. And it shows how studying the Mughals isn't just about some bygone era. It's about understanding the historical forces that shaped the India we know today.
It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the Mughals. So as we start wrapping up our exploration, what are some of the things we should be considering when we talk about the Mughal legacy? Because it's obviously complex. It's not black and white.
Absolutely. It's multifaceted. It's important to remember that they weren't without their flaws. The Mughal Empire, built on conquest, involved its share of violence, oppression. But they also left behind this rich legacy: art, architecture, administrative systems, all of it still shaping India today. So how do we reconcile those two seemingly contradictory things? Acknowledge the achievements, but also confront those darker sides of their rule.
It's a lot to think about. How do we hold those two perspectives at the same time? I think we need to avoid romanticizing the past, but also avoid those simplistic judgments that we might make based on our modern values.
Right. It's about understanding the Moguls within their historical context, their values, beliefs, power structures, but also recognizing how their actions continue to resonate today. How do we navigate this complexity? It's a good question.
So how do we navigate that? What's a good starting point?
Well, I think focusing on those enduring impacts of their systems is a good place to begin. We've talked about how they built upon the systems of their predecessors and how those, in turn, influenced later Indian states, even post-independence India.
Right. Well, you talked about the revenue system, the legal framework, the Mansabdari system. It's amazing to think how those structures from centuries ago are still echoing.
Right. It's a testament to the power of institutions, how they shape societies long after their creators are gone. But it also reminds us that these systems were never static. They were evolving, adapting to new circumstances.
So even as we acknowledge that Mughal influence, it's important to remember that these systems weren't just like imposed on everyone who came after. They were changed, adapted, maybe even subverted to serve new purposes.
Precisely. It's a crucial point. History isn't just this linear progression, one era neatly following the next. It's a dynamic process. Continuity and change woven together, each generation shaping, reinterpreting those legacies of the past.
That makes me think about like individual agency. We've been focused on these big systems, but weren't there individuals, ordinary people, who found ways to navigate, resist, or even manipulate those systems?
Of course. That's where things get really interesting. Look at court records, petitions, legal documents. They reveal how ordinary people interacted with these Mughal systems, challenging them sometimes working within them to achieve their own goals. Reminds us that even within rigid structures, there's always room for individual action, for pushing back, for agency.
That's a powerful insight. Thinking beyond those top-down narratives, recognizing the role of ordinary people in shaping their own destinies, even within the constraints of imperial rule.
And that's a reminder that the study of history is never truly finished. Always new perspectives, new stories, new connections to make.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the Mughal Empire, I'm left with a sense of awe at their accomplishments, a much deeper appreciation for how complex it all was, and a new awareness of those legacies, the good and the bad, that still shape India today.
It's been a fascinating journey. I hope it's inspired you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering all those connections that history offers.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into a new corner of history. Welcome back to the deep dive. It's really been amazing, hasn't it? Exploring the inner workings of the Mughal Empire. So much more to it than we usually think about.
Definitely. And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. Peeling back those layers, finding the nuances, the contradictions, seeing how those impacts, even centuries later, are still with us.
You know, speaking of impacts, you left us with a big question before the break. How do we reconcile those great achievements of the Mughal Empire with, well, the not-so-great parts of their rule?
It's a tough one for sure, no denying it. The Mughal Empire, like any empire, it was built on conquest. There was violence, there was oppression, but it also left behind this incredible legacy. Art, architecture, those systems we've been talking about, still shaping India today. So how do we, I guess, hold those two ideas in our minds at the same time?
It's almost like this paradox, isn't it? On one hand, this sophisticated empire, cultural exchange, innovation, but then the human cost. The expansion, the inequalities that were often baked into the system.
Exactly. And it's something we grapple with when studying any empire or any powerful dynasty throughout history, really. How do we appreciate the achievements, the contributions, but also confront that darker side?
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. How do we hold both perspectives without, diminishing either one? I think it's key to avoid romanticizing the past, but also we can't just apply our modern values and make these snap judgments. It's more complicated than that.
I completely agree. We need to understand the Mughals within their historical context, right? What were the values, the beliefs, the power structures that shaped their world, but then also see how their actions still echo today. It's not just about the past.
So with the Mughal legacy, where do we even begin? How do we navigate all this complexity?
Well, one way is to focus on those enduring impacts of their systems, like we've been discussing. How they took what came before them, built on it, and then how those systems influenced later Indian states, even the British Raj and even post-independence India.
We talked about the revenue system, the legal framework, the Mansabdari system. It's kind of mind-blowing. Those structures, centuries old, still
It
around.
really speaks to the power of institutions, right? How they shape societies long after those who created them are gone. But it's also important to remember those systems weren't static. They were always changing, evolving.
So yeah, we acknowledge the Mughal influence, but we also have to remember that these systems weren't just like a blueprint forced on everyone who came after. They were changed, modified, sometimes even used for totally different purposes.
Exactly. History isn't just a straight line, it's messy. It's this mix of things continuing, things changing. Each generation comes along and they put their own spin on the legacies they inherit.
It makes you think about, like, individual choices.
Yeah.
We've been focusing on these big overarching systems, but weren't there individuals, ordinary people, who figured out ways to work within those systems, or even push back against them?
Absolutely. And that's where things get really exciting, I think. When you look at those court records, petitions, legal documents, you see how people were interacting with these Mughal systems. Sometimes they were challenging them. Sometimes they were figuring out how to use them to their advantage. It shows us that even within these big, powerful structures, there's always room for individual action, for resistance.
Yeah.
People find a way.
That's a powerful thought, isn't it? It's not just the emperors and the elites who shape history. It's also about those everyday choices that people made.
And it reminds us that history, well, it's not some finished book. There are always new stories to uncover, new perspectives, new connections to make between then and now.
So, wrapping up our Mughal Empire deep dive, I'm feeling a lot of things. Awe at what they accomplished, for sure, but also a much better grasp of just how complicated it all was.
Yeah.
And those legacies, good and bad, that are still so relevant to India today.
It's been an incredible journey. I hope it's sparked that curiosity in you to keep exploring history, keep asking questions, keep making those connections.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic and another chance to dive deep into history.